Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Towson Journal of International Affairs Roundtable. And the subject animating the current roundtable are the issues that are facing some developing states in 2020, a variety of angles. Two of them are specifically examining the impact of COVID, one with surprising findings. And the third paper is really not at all to do with COVID, but still some challenges. Our three presenters and their respective topics, in the order in which you will hear them present their research findings, are Amanda Kie, who will be discussing how Ghana has had surprising ability to handle the COVID challenges, and maybe there could be some lessons for America. I don't know. She may talk about it. She may not. She'll surprise us. It'll be exciting. Amanda Ryan will talk subsequently about some of the challenges regarding mental health in developing states that, like developed states, have generally not given so much priority and attention to mental health issues. And as we know about in developed states, COVID has sort of exacerbated problems, and she'll have some specific finding. And India is one of the countries that she focuses on, which brings us to what will be our third topic by Eric Ports, and he'll be talking about a very different set of challenges currently facing India, and in particular, farmers in India. And as he'll illustrate, and as all the papers in their own way will illustrate, the specific challenges that they are identifying and describing seem to tap into larger, bigger issues as well. But I will say nothing more about it. I will let them tell you about their own research and their research. And we'll start with Amanda Kie.
Thank you. Okay, so for over a year, the world has been fighting an international health crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the whole world has combated the virus, developing states have been forced to mobilize weak health systems with limited resources. In states with decreased economic mobility, government regulations must strike a balance between saving lives and protecting the livelihoods of their populations. Among these countries is Ghana, a state classified as a developing economy whose reported COVID-19 death rates have been relatively low. Ghana has a fairly young health system, and by the time the first COVID-19 case reached Ghana, only 40% of the population had access to healthcare. Now, one reason for Ghana's low confirmed death rates is that vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions that are more at risk from the COVID-19 virus, are less concentrated in developing states. And this is because life expectancies in developing states are typically lower than that of developed states. Beyond Ghana's population characteristics, Ghana was quick to enact a 3-week partial lockdown, social distancing measures, travel restrictions, and widespread testing. During this time, Ghana also obtained the necessary testing resources and medical resources to combat the crisis within their borders. After the partial lockdown, Ghana slowly began reducing restrictions. The government opened indoor dining, they opened tourist sites, and reinstated international flights, among other restrictions that were loosened. Confirmed cases, however, began spiking in fall of 2020, leading Ghana to re-implement many regulations. By January of 2021, Ghana had reached over 60,000 confirmed cases, yet still a partial lockdown was not reinstated. Ghana spent over $104 million on obtaining resources for medical purposes and has pledged a total of $1.9 billion to combat the pandemic. To do so, the government had to cut spending on goods and services, transfers, and capital investments. Ghana had to pull from the stabilizing fund and borrow from the Bank of Ghana as well. Not only has government spending felt the effects of the pandemic, but the domestic economy has also been impacted by these restrictions. Ghana's GDP growth for 2020 was at 0.9%, which is the lowest GDP growth Ghana has seen in 37 years. For a state that is reliant on economic growth, partial lockdowns and other pandemic-related restrictions have an immense effect on the economy. which directly affects Ghana's citizens. In countries with developing economies, regulations and lockdowns that hinder economic growth directly affect the livelihood of the population. While the initial lockdown was necessary for the government of Ghana to obtain needed resources and a better understanding of the virus, another partial lockdown would not do more good than it would do harm. Ghana does not have the same economic mobility as developed states such as the United Kingdom, making lockdowns detrimental to economic recovery. Therefore, in Ghana and other developing countries, safety measures such as mask mandates and social distancing regulations are more effective than lockdowns in saving lives while also protecting the livelihood of a state's population.
Thank you, Amanda. Very interesting. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask any of them. We'll save all questions for the end. We will now move to Amanda Ryan, our next Amanda, who will also talk about coronavirus and bridge to Eric. Amanda.
Thank you. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health across the globe has drastically declined, and many developing countries are failing to compensate for this uptake in psychological issues in an effective manner. So for example, despite the overwhelming need for mental health services, up to 85% of individuals with mental health conditions in developing countries do not receive the care they need due to a lack of resources and investment. So looking at developing countries like India, they have over 96 million people who are struggling with depression or anxiety. And yet the Indian government is failing to compensate for the spike in mental health as their system has many issues. For instance, they lack a strong health infrastructure, their healthcare system is very overburdened and insufficient, they have a scarcity of trained mental health professionals, they lack advocacy for mental health across the entire country, and their funding is limited and often mismanaged. So for example, India hasn't organized any major awareness programs for mental health to reduce the stigma, even on days like World Mental Health Day. On the other hand, on International Yoga Day, they spent over $4.5 million to campaign for that issue. So what they choose to prioritize is extremely important and determines which sections of the population receive care and attention they need and which don't. So while these needs have been neglected heavily in the past, so this isn't a new issue that countries are fighting, the significant lack of support for mental health has been placed under the spotlight during the recent pandemic. However, all this attention is one good thing to come out of the pandemic. Because never before have we witnessed more engagement surrounding mental health. So thanks to COVID, everyone is in the same boat of despair and despondency. It has gone from being a problem that was swept under the rug to hitting the ceiling, bringing a sense of unity that can help solve this issue. So now hopefully it can receive the attention and resources it deserves. Even so, many developing countries like India are not addressing this spike and are letting their citizens down in a way that might be challenging to come back from. If mental health needs are continuously unfulfilled, numerous short and long-term consequences will arise that will threaten the stability and livelihood of society. One example of a short-term consequence is seen through suicide rates. Before COVID-19, India had the highest suicide rate in Southeast Asia. But now medical experts are saying the country's mental health system is being pushed to the limit. So according to an online survey conducted by the Suicide Prevention of India Foundation, suicidal intent, self-harm, and relapses have all surged due to the virus. Research conducted by the Suicide Prevention in India Foundation found that nearly 65% of mental health professionals reported an increase in self-harm among their patients. So this is a short-term consequence that we're already seeing and could grow worse very soon. So one example of a long-term consequence that we're predicting due to unmet mental health needs is an economic burden. It's no surprise that the state of mental health of a country correlates positively with its economic growth. So projections show that India will suffer massive economic losses owing to mental health conditions. According to the World Health Organization, economic loss is estimated to be more than $1 trillion by 2030. So unless they act now to address the mental health needs associated with the pandemic, there will be enormous long-term consequences for families, communities, and societies. So to really examine the underbelly of this mental health epidemic, we can analyze the psychological deterioration of citizens in India during the pandemic and their government's inadequate response to determine possible solutions to this critical issue in hopes to resolve it.
Thank you, Amanda. Very interesting, and I'm sensing a theme of resource challenges. And Eric will now enlighten us on some of these challenges in a way that is not related to the coronavirus.
Right. So, late last year, the Indian Parliament passed a series of 3 farming bills, which they claimed would modernize India's agricultural sector. For some background, in India, farmers account for about 70% of the rural population. Many of these farmers live in undeveloped regions that lack proper infrastructure. And 80% of these small farmers rely on the small amount of produce that they can sell to earn a living. For decades now, the situations of these farmers have gotten much worse, with increased costs, smaller crop yields, and, as Amanda mentioned, a growing suicide rate because of this increasingly harsh lifestyle. The bills that were passed removed decades-old protections for farmers, mainly the minimum pricing standards. They deregulated stockholding limits, and they opened an electronic market system. Now, on the surface, none of these problems seem inherently like problems to the farmers, but because of the lack of development in many of these rural states, the electronic market system doesn't really help them much because they don't have proper access to the internet. The other bills specifically, although not directly stated, were seemingly intended to make it easier for corporations to operate within the sector and push out small farmers. Many of those protections that I mentioned before were created to prevent this sort of thing. This move was pretty apparent to farmers, especially in those underdeveloped states. So they took out to the streets to protest. The protests started with mainly transportation blockages, blocking railroads, highways, small strikes. But as the protests grew in the next couple months, they started to march to Delhi, the capital, and many more groups joined in with this, mainly religious minorities and farmers from more developed states. So for months now, the city has been encircled by protesters who have blocked off major highways leading into and out of the capital. This was relatively peaceful at the beginning, but tensions have gotten high at some very particular moments, such as on Republic Day, which is India's day of celebration for their independence from Britain. The protesters decided to have a tractor parade through the city. And during the course of this parade, one of the protesters died. So the police claimed that his tractor had flipped over and crushed him, but the protesters with video claimed that he had been shot by the police, and that prompted a whole new set of tension in the country. So on the same day, the protesters went to India's historical Red Fort, and they raided it. There was a big clash between them and the police, and then subsequent security forces when the military was called in. This protest specifically caused several hundred injuries on both sides. And this was a real turning point for the protests. This garnered a lot of international attention, both because of the numbers of people that were injured, but also the measures that were taken by security forces. After this point, there's a real shift in the way that the relationship between the protesters and the Indian government have been going on. The protesters have remained mainly peaceful in their aims and their methods, but the Indian security forces have really started to crack down on the protests. They've now blocked off the protesters on the highways, making it physically impossible for them to leave, while at the same time firing tear gas, all that sort of thing. And they've started to arrest journalists. This has attracted more international attention. Leaders of other states, political figures, even celebrities, especially in the West, have spoken out against this. This led to a reaction from the supporters of Modi's government, who notably have been burning effigies of several figures from the West, and they've claimed that the West is criticizing India on false grounds, that it is all slander, and they are now protesting to counteract what they think is Western intervention in their country, similar to how the farmers were protesting transnational corporations moving in and moving them out of their own market. At this point, both sides remain pretty steadfast. There have been talks of promises of having talks and settling the issue, but they haven't really gone anywhere. Modi and his government have said straight out that they do not plan to revoke the bills, but the protesters said that they will remain in the capital until the bills are revoked and they get more protections, not only reinstated, but further protections to help them with the decades of problems which they've been facing.
Thank you, Eric. Thank all three of you for very interesting and different presentations, all very uplifting in their own ways. My first question I want to direct to Eric, but I'm going to word it in a way that I hope to hear from both of our other presenters after Eric says his piece. And my question is this. Now, your topic, your research did not concern the pandemic, but do you see the pandemic having had any impact on it, contributed to it, maybe created a climate of tension and stuff that we're all kind of getting used to here? And then obviously for the two Amandas, since the coronavirus is sort of what you're about, I'll ask you guys to address sort of the flip side. Do you think that the coronavirus has intensified systemic issues? So I'm asking Eric first, do you think systemic issues have been intensified by the coronavirus?
Yeah, I would say that they definitely have. Most of these protests started when COVID was still not a huge area of focus in India. But the economic downturn as a result of it, especially in the West, I think is what caused a lot of these tensions to flare up. I think that the main effect the pandemic had in starting the protests was in the bills themselves. I think that when the global economy had its downturn, the Indian government was similarly pressured by this, and they were seeking foreign investment. They'd already been looking for that, especially. I think that this is kind of a project in the works, but I think the timing of this really kind of was prompted by the economic effects of the pandemic. So they passed the bills very quickly. They announced them and then passed them within, I think it was a month.
Imagine.
And I think that the main goal there was to sort of tackle this growing economic problem as quick as possible by attracting transnational corporations. And the farmers, no doubt, felt the effects of the pandemic in the same way. So their immediate action that they took was, I would argue, definitely sort of brought on by the tension caused by the pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you. And now, would either of the Amandas like to address the flip side?
Yeah, I would love to. So I would say that the pandemic definitely highlighted some systemic issues here for Ghana. The Health Service of Ghana was created in the 1990s, and so it's fairly young. It's undergone major reforms in the last 30 years. and it's made a lot of strides, but it's still not fully developed. Like many developing countries, resources in Ghana are sometimes stretched thin, and they go to wherever public services are seen as most vital. So although, Ghana has come a very long way in development, there's still a lot of growth that needs to happen. The pandemic, it really just highlighted gaps in the healthcare system because the healthcare system was so heavily relied on here. That being said, I would say that Ghana mobilized their health system very quickly and was very quick to redirect funds in order to combat the crisis. As a result, though, energy and finances have been pulled away from other areas of government responsibility. And overall, the pandemic really just emphasized the limits of financial mobility that Ghana has as a developing state.
Thank you.
Yeah, to expand on that, I'd agree with that. For me at least, mental health was a really big issue even before the pandemic, but it definitely intensified what people were feeling and what governments had to handle. Because before the pandemic, India was actually one of the largest populations affected from mental illness, even so much so that the World Health Organization labeled them as the world's most depressing country. So this wasn't a new thing that they were going through. Even up to 2017, 1 in 7 people in India suffered from a mental illness. So it was no exaggeration to suggest that this country was under a mental health epidemic. But parts of COVID that made this worse was actually the things that the government was doing to halt the virus, to halt the spread of the virus. So they were implementing these non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as they were doing stay-at-home orders and they were shutting down schools and workplaces. And this was really good to halt the virus, but it led to drastic effects that negatively impacted mental health, such as the widespread employment loss, financial struggles, social isolation from loved ones, experiencing an increase in death rates in general, not being able to properly grieve for people, and especially a spike in child and domestic abuse because these people who weren't going to school and the parents aren't going to work, so they're with each other 24/7. So it's a lot of extra time for these toxic environments to really impact people in that way. So the real extent of domestic violence during COVID is likely underestimated. We still don't know the full extent and the measurement of that. So the stress from these factors served as precursors for depression, anxiety, and in some cases, PTSD from the trauma. So mental health in India and many developing countries especially, it's severely worsened during the pandemic.
All interesting responses. Thank you. And I am going to pick on you again, Amanda. And of course, I would like all three of you to address this insofar as you find it relevant. And I don't really, I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about this. Do you think that outside states, and I'll conjecture the West, perhaps, have been contributing to the problem or helping to ameliorate it? Have they been part of the problem or part of the solution?
So I think external support is actually a part of the solution for mental health. I think in India in particular, their healthcare system is very understaffed and undereducated to handle this crisis to the severity that it needs to be. So by getting external support from different organizations like the Pan American Health Organization, they've been actually working with countries to strengthen their policies and services to expand online learning. So one of the things they've been doing with domestic violence survivors is they've been teaching their healthcare workers how to identify signals from these survivors that might not be able to just outright say, hey, I'm going through this trauma, but they've been using hand signals or code words. And so this type of learning is really important, and it's coming from an external source that India might not have been able to cultivate on their own. And in regards to that, India in general, their culture is embedded in a stigma around mental health. And for them, mental health is not an open conversation. It's not something that they see if they see someone struggling, they encourage that person to get help. So by having these external forces come in and educate society in general to open up this conversation, this will really help people who might be afraid to get help and to reduce this stigma. So for me, at least for mental health, I think it's really important to reach for these other countries to reach out and extend what they know onto India and other developing countries.
And thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this?
Well, while my topic is very different than Amanda's, I also think that external influences are positive for Ghana in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that is the way with many developing countries, as they have benefited a lot from funds from the international community, specifically with the economic downturns and the struggles with financing the battle against the pandemic. And I can say for Ghana, just last week, the International Monetary Fund approved a disbursement of, I think, $1 billion from the Rapid Credit Facility. And so this is supposed to help Ghana in fighting the health crisis. And it's supposed to kind of compensate for financial needs and balance of payment issues Ghana has recently been struggling with as a result of the economic impacts. So I think for sure, Ghana has benefited economically from external influences from the international community. That's an example of an IGO that has been very helpful for Ghana. In addition, Ghana has been getting shipments of vaccines, and that really is as a result of partnerships between different IGOs and governments. So specifically, the World Health Organization, the European Union, and UNICEF, I know, partnered to send vaccines to Ghana and other states. So that has also been of benefit for Ghana in fighting the pandemic, which, you know, for many developing states, they really can't do alone because that's stretching their government resources very thin.
Eric?
Yeah, I want to take the flip side of this argument. I think that foreign influence, specifically foreign aid, is kind of the source of the problem that I tackled here. So with foreign aid, there typically is an expectation when it comes to the country that's receiving the aid, whether that be through like typical interest loan repayments that, or as it pertains to India, a sort of expectation from the government to act in favor of those giving them the assistance. The question of opening up the agricultural sector to transnational corporations isn't just coming from the Indian government, it's also coming from the IGOs and other governments that have been giving India aid for the maybe past half century. By opening up the market to these transnational corporations, whether or not that is a direct result of expectations, that is the direct cause of these protests. The protesters are mainly aiming at the role that these corporations would play in pushing them out of the market in which they've made their livelihood for generations. So I would say when it comes to this, it's not just the foreign aid and the opening of that particular market, but also when it comes to the protests themselves, when the international community decided to voice their opinions on this matter, that's when the supporters of Modi and his party, they sprang up on their own in protest against what they thought was Western interference in their country. Before this point, the supporters were critical of the protests, but once they felt like they were encircled by the international community, they also took action. And that's when violence wasn't just between the police and the protesters, but now it's between the farmers and the supporters of the government. So I would say that the source of this, in large part, comes from the actual foreign interference and the sort of idea that comes along with that to the people in India.
Very interesting. All three of you, in your presentations and answering both questions, have made it pretty clear that the things that you're focusing on are embedded in larger transnational forces. A pandemic kind of shaping things, and IGOs and externally derived values shaping the debate. And so my final question is, do you see any of these things, especially those that maybe originate from outside the state, changing the policies of the governments themselves? In other words, do you see not just the issue being affected, but the government may be responding in a way so that we can say, well, the government's doing that because of whatever external influence? And I just want to say that some of you have been focusing on IGOs and some have been focusing on other states. And it seems to me that there's a different kind of influence coming from each kind of actor. So if you can, try to address both. Say, well, then the IGOs are not having any effect whatsoever, but other states are. If you didn't research it, that's fine. You could just talk about what you researched. But I would be curious to see in case that there's a difference in the specific issue that you're studying in this. And I will ask Amanda Kie to address this first.
So yeah, that was a loaded question, but I would say in particular, I would say Ghana's government regulations in response to the pandemic have been largely influenced by reactions of other states and organizations. I think this is likely the case for many countries around the world, as the pandemic has been developing, and we've been learning new information and ways to deal with it. So in particular, I know Ghana has looked towards the World Health Organization for guidance and ideas of how to implement policy. I know that when numbers started spiking in, I believe it was Italy, Ghana started implementing travel restrictions for anyone traveling to regions like Italy or it was China or anywhere else that had spikes in cases. And this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. And as a result, Ghana then required mandatory quarantines for anyone who traveled to those areas. And they actually caught a decent amount of cases that way. So that is a good way of how they initially controlled the pandemic. And for that, they definitely looked towards what was happening elsewhere in the world. So I think I might have gone away from your question a bit, but
no, you just in a still different way. So please go.
So yes, they've definitely looked towards IGOs for guidance on information, for also, guidance with vaccines, as I mentioned before, and vaccine shipments as well, and also financial compensation to help with funding their defense against the pandemic. So IGOs have been very helpful in that way. I would say for other states, like I just mentioned, looking at other states' numbers and deciding, how their policy should look in regards to other states. They definitely did at the beginning of the pandemic. I would say that those regulations have definitely been adjusted as time went on, but as this is a very developing issue, they're definitely looking towards other actors in the international realm to figure out what's going on and definitely following international norms here.
Either of the India, Eric?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I touched on some of this already, but I don't think, as it pertains to how the government has reacted to these protests, I don't think that the international community has done anything to help, as well-intentioned as they might have been. The government has not swayed in the methods it's used. Journalists still remain imprisoned. The protesters are still being having tear gas fired at them and being rounded up and arrested. No matter how much condemnation they've gotten for any of the measures they've taken or the bills themselves, they have not swayed at all. That I don't know if that has any sort of bearing on, or if that has any sort of correlation to the fervor that their supporters have had about the international community's reaction, how like the support they've gotten for their measures. But the government itself has signaled directly that it does not plan to change course, no matter who says that they are wrong or who agrees with them. There haven't been many states that have condoned their actions, but regardless, yeah, that they don't seem as if they're going to let anyone else tell them how to handle this situation.
India is a state that currently is helmed by a very nationalist regime, and so that's to be expected. So I'm curious to hear how Amanda Ryan describes it, because the mental health doesn't quite excite the nationalism the way external criticism of how you're and farmers, by the way, is always an area unusually connected to nationalist themes. So how are states dealing? Have you noticed a dynamic more similar to Ahmed Kia's observations, or more like Eric's?
Definitely more like Amanda's. She mentioned the World Health Organization, and they've definitely commented on the insufficiencies of India's mental health workforce. And they've made that pretty well known that they're not doing too well. Even before the pandemic, they had a shortage of psychiatrists and psychologists in the country compared to the people that needed help. They had a statistic that India had 3 psychiatrists for every million people and even fewer psychologists. And in regards to COVID, they revealed that the pandemic suspended mental health support services in 93% of countries, so not just developing countries, were impacted. Even the Red Cross, they did a survey, and including countries like the Philippines and different countries, that showed that 1 in 2 adults believe that their mental health was negatively affected by COVID-19. So it's definitely an issue that they saw. And so even before COVID, in regards to India and what they suggested India do, because the World Health Organization had recommendations even before COVID for India. And they underlined that mental health and well-being in general is fundamental to the quality of life. And so it's a priority that all governments should have. But for India, mental health wasn't a big issue in their elections or any of their political parties. But providing good mental health to its citizens is a fundamental right guaranteed by their constitution. It's called the right of life, and it has been interpreted by the Supreme Court as not just safeguarding the mere act of breathing or existing, but ensuring the quality of life and human dignity. So in 2017, India acknowledged this by enacting the National Mental Health Care Act to provide for mental health services and care for people with mental illnesses and to protect their rights. So this act made access to good treatment and care mandatory, but the low level of investment in health has resulted in a low ratio of medical staff to patients. So according to the World Health Organization, there was about 30 psychiatrists, 12 nurses, 7 psychologists, 7 social workers for every 10 million Indians, compared to its recommended minimum of 300 for each category. So even with their recommendations, India still wasn't able to hit that mark. And this was before COVID. So after COVID, the World Health Organization included mental health services as a recommendation for countries in their response plans to COVID-19. So it was definitely recommended, but still countries, even if they reported that they were going to include this, only 17% said they committed additional funding to actually make it happen. So it's urgent that mental health support is considered a critical component of pandemic response, as we cannot simply afford to wait until the epidemic is under control before dealing with this massive increasing psychological toll. So to have any hope of stopping and recovering from this pandemic in the way that leaves no one behind, we need to treat the psychological and physical distress at the same time. So that's definitely something that all countries should include in their response plans, but still, it's still something that's severely, severely lacking.
Okay, so what I get is that Amanda Kie saw a government responding favorably to external. Eric found the government saying screw you to external influence, and Amanda Ryan found the government saying to external efforts to influence. Like, when we can get to it, but agnostic. In all three cases, what we see are states that are of necessity trying to do a lot more with a lot less. And I do notice that IGOs seem to be making efforts in all cases, at least efforts, to make things better, and in some cases in a meaningful fashion. So maybe there's a lesson to be derived there from the role of IGOs and dealing with these things. But there's a whole lot more that we could talk about here, but we would be here all night, and we're not going to be here all night. So I will say that we are at the end of this roundtable meeting, and I want to thank our three researchers and presenters of information to help to give us a lot to think about. Thank you.